Good morning, everyone, and to our participants in Germany, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on the topic, the future of transatlantic collaboration in biopharma and medtech post-pandemic. We're glad that you could all join us today for what promises to be an interesting discussion. My name is Justin Flaxbart. I'm the Senior Manager in the Consulting Department at the German-American Chamber of Commerce in Chicago, and it's my great pleasure to get to moderate today's event. Today's webinar is part of a year-long Transatlantic Webinar Series leading through Crisis, which is aimed at examining transatlantic trade topics that were disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic and finding solutions to overcome these challenges together and stronger. The project is supported by the Transatlantic Program of the Federal Republic of Germany, funded by the European Recovery Program, or ERP, of the Federal Ministry of Economics and Energy, and we are very thankful for their generous financial support. Before we get started today, just a few housekeeping notes. Elena, if you could please share the slides here.
Are you seeing my screen?
I sure am. It's pulled up.
Perfect.
If you could get me to the fast forward to the housekeeping slide, please.
There we go.
Okay, great. There we are. First thing, as always in these sorts of settings, please do mute yourself during the discussion so that we avoid any feedback or background noise coming in. Of course, during the interactive Q&A session after the moderated panel discussion, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions of the panelists. Throughout the event, you are welcome to share your questions and comments in the chat function. I think we are all familiar with how to do that. You can also switch the view on your screen if you so desire between the speaker view and the gallery view by using the box in the upper right hand corner. And I do have a colleague here with me today. She's named GACC Midwest and is there for any technical support. So please shoot her a chat or raise your hand and she can help you if you're experiencing any technical difficulties throughout today's event. Next slide, please. Great. I will let them introduce themselves in greater detail in just a couple of minutes, but I would like to take a second here to recognize and thank the expert panelists who are joining us with their insights here today. First of all, we have Sebastian Körner, the Regulatory Affairs Manager from Makotic GmbH in Germany. We're also joined today by Hage Levy, co-founder and CEO of Illuria Health. It's a startup actually based in Israel, interestingly. And we have Professor Dr. Katharina Blankart, who is the Assistant Professor of Health Economics at the University of Duisburg-Essen. So thanks to all of our panelists once more for joining us here today. And before we get started, I'd also like to give a quick shout out to our promotional partners who helped us spread the word about today's event. These are MHub, which is a Chicago-based innovation center, as well as Medizin.NRW, a medical technology cluster in the German state of Nordrhein-Westfalen. Elena, if you could please pull up today's agenda and let's take a quick look at that. Great, so the agenda for today's event is seen on your screen here. This is a rather flexible agenda, so if one of the sections runs a little bit long, we'll just keep going, but this is the order that we'll do things in. First here, my welcome remarks, then we'll have some introductions and short presentations from our three panelists, followed by the panel discussion that I will be moderating, of course, then a Q&A with the audience, and then time permitting, we'll spend the rest of the time until the scheduled event wrap up of 10:30 Central in a virtual networking round. So we'll break into smaller breakout rooms and do some virtual networking with one another to end today's program. Okay, with that, I'd like to start. Has Hage been able to log in? Unfortunately, one of our speakers was having some issues. He's there, great. Hage, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to start off today by please sharing your presentation and giving a little insight into your startup company.
So can you just allow me to share my screen? Still blocked? Still blocked?
Okay, let me see.
Yeah, great.
It's working now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that.
No problem. Just a second. Do you see my screen?
Yes, it's loading right now.
Yeah, it's a bit slow. Just a second. Yeah, sorry for that. Yeah, okay, great. So first of all, I apologize for the technical difficulties. I decided to wait in the Teams link for some reason. And then I saw that no one's approving, so I apologize for that.
Not a problem.
It happens. So again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. So my name is Hagai Levi. As you mentioned, I'm from Israel. I'm the founder and CEO of Illuria. Illuria is a digital health company focusing on remote patient monitoring for mental and behavioral health disorders. And the initial disorder we're starting with is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, ADHD is considered to be a chronic disorder with short-term attributes of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and some pretty severe long-term implications if not properly treated. Please meet Elad. Elad is my now 10-year-old son. He was diagnosed with ADHD at a very, very young age. And it was almost impossible for us to manage his treatment as we could never assess whether the medical treatment was effective or not. And Elad is not alone. One in, roughly speaking, 10 kids and 1 in 20 adults are diagnosed with ADHD, and their treatment processes are almost completely trial and error based. And the reason for that is that after the initial diagnosis starts a never-ending calibration of the medical treatment as our physiology is changing. And this stage is completely trial and error based using manual subjective questionnaires, same as it was 20, 30 years ago, with not only some poor clinical implications, but also enormous cost, which results from this volatile, subjective, and completely manual process. And this is the gap that we're trying to solve. We are basically developing a solution which will streamline the entire process, and as a decision support, will deliver continuous and objective monitoring. And the basic idea is to analyze changes in physiological markers. The system, which is a software, basically speaking, retrieves physiological markers from any smart commercial device, any Apple Watch or Fitbit, for sake of discussion. And then we trained algorithms to mathematically analyze changes in these markers and deliver analysis reports to the different stakeholders. As you mentioned, we are not in production yet. We are still an early stage company, but we did finish 2 clinical trials, one in Israel and one in the States with Cincinnati Children's Hospital. But just like to wrap up the product side, I will present you with the old versus the new. So as I mentioned, the current method, which is the gold standard, is manual, completely subjective, and super expensive. Whereas in the new approach, by doing passive measurements, we can deliver analysis in many layers, starting from a pinpoint analysis of like daily effectiveness, basically proxy pharmacokinetics curves, so to speak, and then more aggregated data in the sense of what happens before or after we titrate the medications, what are the ongoing patterns, and basically completely eliminating the trial and error element. A few words about the business. We are targeting the institutional players. This slide is a bit US oriented, obviously, but the combined value proposition is basically generic, both better caregiving and immense cost reduction. The parents are always a very valid stakeholder, and they are actually the focal point in ADHD, and we will target them as the lowest hanging fruit tactically. The pharma players are a huge stakeholder in the market. There are some other major stakeholders to discuss about, but we don't have too much time to elaborate on them yet. The total addressable market is enormous, basically due to the prevalence, the associated cost, and the price point that we are currently still assuming. Just to sum up this 5-minute speech, I will describe where we're at this stage, because as you mentioned, we're not in production yet. We just completed the seed round that you see here in the middle. We've done a super long kickoff phase with lots of validations. I mentioned the 2 clinical trials. We secured the IP for several disorders. And in the next year, we aim to be in production, both to gain initial commercialization at a B2B2C mode and gain some more clinical traction, both in the US and in Europe. Actually, in the territories that you see here, in the countries that you see here in this slide. As of this morning, we're still bootstrapping, so the team is pretty small, but we are recruiting, now that the round is concluded, We're recruiting basically software programmers, but aside from the internal team and the advisory board, we're getting a lot of support from the different providers we're working with. And as I mentioned, the goal in the next year is to gain initial traction, both to sense the market and both to move into initial commercialization. So this is us, again, in a nutshell. I will be happy to address any questions that you have. Again, I can basically provide our perspective as a small company that did get a lot of traction, like many acceleration programs and everything. But yeah, basically speaking, this is what we're doing in Illuria.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction to your company, Hage, and of course look forward to hearing your insights in the discussion about some of the particular challenges and successes that you've had in really getting this off the ground during the middle of a global pandemic. Next, I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Dr. Katarina Blankart, excuse me, to introduce herself and give an overview of her professional focus areas.
Right. Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for being here today in the panel. I'm really excited to share some insights from my research, but also discuss this in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Duisburg-Essen, so that's in the deep west, in the so-called Rust Belt of Germany and North Rhine-Westphalia. I'm affiliated with one of the 4 research centers in health economics, CINCH, which stands for Competent in Competition and Health. And the reason why I'm here today probably is that, parts of my research have focused on analyzing policies to foster innovation and also ensure global access and affordability. So what I want to show you here is the value chain of bringing products to market that, as many of you know, start at discovery and development, where we have patent protection and other means to secure IP. Then it goes over to preclinical research, where we could talk about the public sponsoring of clinical research and public-private partnerships that have become very important in the context of the COVID pandemic, and then goes over to demonstrating quality, which is mostly performed by obtaining product authorization in Europe by the European Medicines Agency and national authorities, or the Food and Drug Administration's reviews that also know special policies for small and neglected markets, such as orphan drugs and priority and accelerated review. We then know, and that's something that I have taken a closer look at from a German perspective, that at least across the pond in Europe, many healthcare systems have started to evaluate the value beyond efficacy and quality. So in terms of what does this new technology or this new drug bring us about in terms of mortality, morbidity, quality of life. And here we can take a closer look at AMNOG. And what is also very important, and I think what has also COVID has shown us, is that we should not only look at the initial step in bringing innovations to the market, but that we should also look at the supply chain in terms of looking at what happens when we need to think about where we produce products, at what volume, and which products are the ones that are potentially going short. Here are just some highlights of the research that I've done in that context. So, for example, looking at the relationship between funding research and knowledge production, we have evaluated the role of the European Union's FP7 framework program and the Horizon 2020 in the knowledge production of medical devices, showing that public funding, at least in Europe, but there's also other evidence from the United States, is very supported. I'm currently investigating the role of on versus off-label use in the medication in the United States. What I want to bring in today is mostly about the value-based decision-making and price negotiations according to AMNOG. AMNOG is a policy that came into place around 10 years ago in Germany, that asked for the value of a new product to be demonstrated by the manufacturer in a dossier, and that also then uses that information to negotiate prices for patients in statutory health insurance. Bringing some interesting perspective into access to care and so on. All right, and with that, I think I want to thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction, Katarina. And of course, looking forward to discussing all of these topics with you and a little bit more deeply going forward here. Then great, last but not least, I'd like to turn the floor over now to our final panelist of the day, Sebastian Körner from Makotic. And Makotic actually played an interesting and important role in the global distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine, but I'll let Sebastian tell you about that.
So, welcome everybody also from Germany, from the eastern part. Thank you for having me here. My name is Sebastian Körner. I'm working for Makotic GmbH. We are specialists in deep cooling, storage, and today I want to tell you how we became a solution provider for the pharmaceutical supply chain for COVID-19 vaccines. So the main points to tell you about Makotic, we have experience in the field of cold storage down to 125 degrees minus Celsius for medical products. We are right now the leading global supplier for electrical cryotechnology solutions. The company was founded, or the roots are in the mid-90s, where we begin with some cold air devices for some special treatments in medical, but we also are builder for cryo chambers, which are lack of nitrogen technology, which are mainly causing deaths in the US also, but our technology is based on electronics. We have extensive experience in large-scale projects also for the industry, not only in pharmaceutical, but also in food industry. Our production and research site is located in the eastern part of Germany, in Saxony-Anhalt, in Bitterfeld-Wolfen. Our sales and service representations are located all around the world, main also in Germany, France, Italy, but we have built up directed also in USA and Asia. Our company is building not only industrial products, but also medical products, where we are certified in the ISO 13485 and 9001. But the main DNA of the company is the innovation and flexibility, where we have 120 people working for Makotic, roughly. This is quite small, but big enough to play a role also in vaccination storage. So how could we be a part of it? DHL supplied with a white paper thinking about all the roles of people and also of goods flow during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. And there, in the first step, they came up with the idea that for first world countries, it would be important in the first step to produce as much vaccines as you can get. And in the first time, they would be rolled out immediately and vaccinated to all the people. But they also had in mind that there would be a stage 2, where we would have problems in storage of the mRNA vaccines. As you all know, there are higher requirements for storing those vaccines down to minus 60 degrees Celsius or even lower. And therefore, they were asking or searching for possibilities to store those vaccines. And there we come into the field. We are able to combine different competences. On the left side, you see a cryo chamber, where we are able to manage temperatures from minus 85 to minus 110 degrees Celsius.
Sorry to stop you there, Sebastian. You said on the left side. I don't know if you're attempting to share a presentation, but I'm not seeing it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Not a problem.
I thought
you were just
sharing...
wanting to just share verbally. I didn't until that second. I didn't realize there were accompanying slides. My apologies for not mentioning it earlier.
I thought I was going through the slides all the time. Can you see my slide right now?
Yes, they're up now. Thank you. Okay,
so you missed some visual slides on the beginning, but yeah, now welcome back. On the left side, you see a cryo chamber which we produce. This is mainly for physiotherapy or for, let's say, lifestyle. You have -85 to -110 degrees. And there we have the knowledge about handling those deep temperatures, and also about connectivity, where you can control the device via internet. On the main picture in the middle, you see our medical product, which is a cold air device. There we have the knowledge about all the regulatory requirements regarding medical products. This is a small serial production which we are able to provide since mid of 90s. So it's roughly about 250 devices a year. And on the right side, you see an example picture of a large-scale industrial product, where it's storage with deep cooling, a larger area. And if you combine all those competences, you could come up with solutions for storing vaccines. Yeah. So in the beginning of 2021, we were contacted and asked if we could build a roll up into storage. So on the left-hand side, you see which we have achieved right now. This is a storage chamber for -80 degrees for vaccines. This is a large storage area where you can store and handle the vaccines without breaking the cooling chain. This was done in roughly 2 months since we were asked for this product in planning, building, and delivering. On the middle, you see the second project, which was then right afterwards. This is a container, standard container, 20 feet, where we built in a storage possibility for vaccines, double redundant. So it means you have connection electric and with a diesel power generator. So if one fails, you have 3 left for storage of the vaccines at the right temperature. You could put this into 50 degrees Celsius. This would cool the vaccines down to -60. They would be fine. This was done in roughly 5 months since we were asked to delivery. This first project was delivered to the Philippines and runs now. And on the right-hand side, you see the last project in this role, where we were asked by a big vaccine producer to store in a logistic container vaccines, where you can transport the container without storage, but for the local storage then for the vaccines. This is a 4 feet high cube container with also double redundant electrical components, where you can store a lot of vaccines. These all projects are vastly flexible. And as you can see also, this is a small serial product where we were able to build up this knowledge, the product, and deliver it in 7 months. So for 8 units. So we're highly flexible in this area. And we had great support by the vaccine producers, by the European Union, by doing steps by breaking limits. So we were thankful for this. And with this, I want to thank also you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Sebastian. You can maybe stop the screen share and we'll start off then with the panel discussion. Well, While Sebastian's working on turning his slide off, I'll just go ahead and get the discussion started here. I wanted to actually begin the panel discussion by circling back to a topic that Katarina had mentioned during her opening remarks, and namely that value-based decision making. So first of all, Katarina, if you could explain maybe what's the connection between this value-based decision making and the development of the COVID vaccine, or was there a connection there, or what influence did this sort of approach have on the vaccine development?
Well, I think if we start off with the COVID-19 vaccines, I think the value to us is all very clear, right? And this probably also justified all the efforts that we have now been taking to accelerate the pipeline, to parallelize marketing authorization. Because if we think about the projected gains, and probably you also see that in your countries, is that vaccinated individuals get less infected. We are probably seeing high gains in mortality that we still need to quantify. But I think to all of us, it's very clear that the value of the vaccines that they create, also the economy, so the COVID-19 vaccines is very, very large. So I think there the question of value is rather straightforward. How does this connect to value-based decision making? Well, if we think about all the other technologies, and some of the technologies we've seen here also along the pipeline, the case for value is probably not as clear, right? So we can also think about the other 50 new chemical entities that have sought approval by the US FDA, that also need some kind of an assessment to what extent they benefit towards society, to what extent they benefit individuals. And this is where value-based decision making is basically coming in.
Interesting. So what would then be kind of the pros and cons, or maybe the lessons learned since we switched to this more value-based decision-making approach in Germany from this, and in terms of negotiating prices for drug reimbursement?
Well, so in Germany, we now can look back at around 10 years of AMNOG, Arzneimittelmarktneuordnungsgesetz, where we evaluate all new pharmaceuticals. We are now starting to do a similar things for digital health applications, which I think is the first country in the world, more or less, doing that. The question is, to what degrees do we lose access to new technologies once we start doing value-based decision making? And I think this is one of the critical questions that are also in the room in the United States, that, what are the potential losses in access? And what we see from these 10 years now is actually not that much. So it's only very few manufacturers opting out of the market, but most of these products do not show added benefit compared to what is already there. So from the healthcare system's perspective, it's actually, probably not that big of a loss. Also from the manufacturer's point of view, it becomes much more clear what the value is that payers value in terms of the added gains. So in the beginning, manufacturers didn't really like the regulation, but right now they see it's very reliable. They can basically rely on, if I show the benefit, I'm also pretty sure that I will succeed and will be able to negotiate a good price. Also comparing, and that's my final remark here, comparing authorized products in the US and Germany, and that's something that I've also started to do, is that when we compare the products launched in Germany compared to the products launched in the US, we see that there may be some products that are not launched in Germany that are launched in the US, but it's actually not a lot. And it doesn't seem that the AMNOG regulation that came into place has changed that much, mostly to products that are rather small markets, or where we don't see, that are seemingly not much better than what we've seen so far before.
Okay, understood. Interesting. So let me ask then, Sebastian and Hage, has this AMNOG or value-based decision-making come into play so far for your companies? Sorry, an industry outsider here. Is this only for pharmaceuticals directly, or for all sort of medical technologies?
So I will address this question initially again as a young company, who again is still not in production and still cementing the product market fit. And again, I'm addressing the specific silo that we are focusing on, which is basically speaking mental health. So obviously in mental health, obviously the value-based care is of a huge motivation to the pharma player. This is, that goes with that saying, because there's a huge adherence problem in, let's say specifically in ADHD, like over 70%, I mean 70% of the patients will leave the treatment in less than 2 years because you cannot measure anything. So the value-based care treatment, precision medicine is obviously of a huge interest to the pharma players. But actually, I think that with regards to the value-based care and being able to measure everything and to personalize everything, actually, I think that in the same silo, you can also place with them basically the payers and providers, because aside from the value-based care mechanisms, which are currently being under instruction and everything, the core, most basic element is, cost reduction. And looking at the mental health ecosystem, and specifically ADHD, same goes for anxiety, depression, and other disorders. The most trouble and problem, aside from the trial and error treatment process, is the loss of labor, because the back and forth is there. Everything is completely subjective. People are telling stories, and from these stories, you have to actually determine a medical treatment or titration or whatever. So I would say that the motivation for adopting value-based schemes or mechanisms, or even self-adopting value-based notions, is also belongs to the parents and providers, and obviously the parents, if you're talking about young kids, because this is like the main concern of the parents. So it's definitely not only the motivation of the pharma players.
Okay, understood. Sebastian, do you have anything to add on this value-based decision-making topic, or does it maybe not apply so much directly to you in the field that you're in?
Yes, you're right. I don't see any influences right now for our company. There might be companies from medical products which are influenced, but we're just touching the field of storage. So if there might be decisions value-based, then this is at the vaccine producer, not on our side.
Understood. Great. So I see that Katarina just shared a link to some additional reading if anyone is interested. It just popped up quickly on my screen, but it looked like the heading had something to do with how does this AMNOG or value-based decision-making affect American companies. So maybe Katarina, if you could just give us the couple of key points from the link that you just shared.
No, this is just a couple of studies in the context. So if you want to read up what that could also mean from an American perspective, then yeah, these are some insights. I mean, another insight that I can share, and I think that's also a question, is, what does such a quality evaluation then also do with regards to diffusion? And that's what we have taken a look much more closely from the early times of AMNOG. And what we've seen is that if the regulator, so that's the Federal Joint Committee, is awarding or is saying, well, this has a positive benefit compared to our treatment standard, it's also that these technologies diffuse quicker, right? So they reach patients quicker, and this is basically an additional value of the process that some also manufacturers may not be aware of when they are filing their papers basically to the regulator, which is quite comprehensive, if you can imagine German bureaucracy.
Understood. So just final question I would have on this topic, and then we'll move on, is kind of what is the interplay then, Katarina, between this and kind of the patent system in Germany or at the EU level? How do these systems work with one another?
Well, I think patent is just one stage earlier, right? This secures the intellectual property of the inventor, and demonstrating value is much more product focused in terms of the health technology that is then provided. So I think because there have also been questions or discussions about, about the patents of the COVID-19 vaccines, and I believe or my opinion in that sense is also that these are two different stages, right? So first is invention, and the second one is the question, how do we bring, or how do we design a technology that we bring to a patient?
Excellent. Great. Well, moving on, as mentioned in my welcoming remarks, this event series is specifically addressing ways that the COVID pandemic affected companies in both sides of the Atlantic. So wanted to also just take a little bit of time to explore how the companies represented on today's panel, were affected by the pandemic, both in terms of challenges and potentially, for the case of Makotic, business opportunities. But starting with you, Sebastian, the general public, of course, has heard read a lot about the development of the actual vaccines. But to be honest with you, I myself, and maybe most people outside the industry, never gave a whole lot of thought into the storage and distribution aspects and some of the logistical challenges in ramping up those technologies in short orders. So I know that you already touched on this a bit in your opening PowerPoint, but if you could maybe delve a little bit deeper, how is it that Makotic was able in such rapid timelines to develop and bring to market, both from the development as well as production standpoint, of these sort of cryogenic containers for the vaccines? And maybe if there were any lessons that your company learned along the way that you could share that might help companies to maybe be more agile or quicker to market in the future with new treatments or technologies.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, as mentioned, the core DNA of Makotic is completely working flexible. So our open-minded CEO had the idea also to come up with storage possibilities for vaccines before we were asked. He was thinking about writing down notes, and as we were asked, he had something in mind which we could easily build. We had also taken over a small company which had even more competences in building industrial storages. So this was combined, and therefore a small development team. We were working so overdue, so not just eight hours a day. So we were like 10 to 12 hours working on this project, really getting it forward also on the weekends. We were pushed also by the vaccine producers for sure, but we also had help from them. One story, we had problems with one supplier. They had delivery times for components, as everyone who produces electrical devices has problems in supply chains. We had problems with one piece. We asked them in, let's say, August, and they said they could deliver in January. So this was the fact. We could then deliver in February, but as you've seen, we also have delivered the products. We had help from the European Union. They sent out a letter for the vaccine producer where they state it's important. They are a big supplier for vaccine storage. Please, do everything which you can do to help them with their supplies. So we had this letter, we sent it out to our supplier, and the next day we had the parts. So we had really, really much help from the producer, from the European Union in this place. We see what can be done if you're really part of an important chain. So we are thankful for that. And for sure, in this short time, as we have built this storage containers, this is not just working like from A to B. We missed some points. We had some documentation lacking. We had to document to document things afterwards. So, but the things we learned is you have to really communicate with your customer, with your client from the beginning on. So you need to see what are they about to do with the product, what do they want to do. We had, so to say, one fact that 2 days before delivery, we learned a lesson that they couldn't do it as they wanted because we missed the point, but we fixed it and we had just 1 day delay. So keep going, keep meeting them, keep communicating, asking questions, even if you think they are dumb. you only can learn or having a smile back. That's the main point. Yeah, and then one main point for producing devices for medical products, for storing, keep the view of the users. If you develop products, get into the view of the users who use this machines, or even the technician who installs it. Keep asking questions. What might be the problem from my side of view? And then you get requirements from that. You build it in from the beginning on, so you don't have problems at the end of the process. Yeah, and if you're able, if you get from small serial production to a big serial production, then think about construction kits like we've seen in the automotive industry also, so that you have like a kit where we take out parts, like we have done our competences in the storage for bigger parts or regulatory parts. You get them together, build a product, and they are fast.
Understood. Excellent. Hage, so turning the question to you now, of course, you launched Illuria shortly before the pandemic hit, and of course, a lot of the deliverable steps in the process of getting your company off the ground were taking place during a pandemic where, of course, as we all know, there were very strict travel restrictions. And of course, as you showed on your slides, you have a lot of international partners in America, Europe, and beyond. So I assume this means that you were kind of leveraging some virtual tools throughout the launch process. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that experience was like, getting a startup off the ground in this interesting environment, and maybe what you learned along the way. Is this maybe a model going forward where we can accelerate things by maybe cutting out some of the airline travel back and forth? I don't know, but please share your insights.
I think yes, echoing on the second or the last sentence that you mentioned, I think it's a different ecosystem now. Again, taking it one step backwards, the timing wasn't ideal. It's not as if we planned the pandemic and who knew, but obviously it was super challenging because the question wasn't an operational question. We're in an inception stage. Basically speaking, we still are. I mean, we're still evolving. We're still trying to cement the product market fit. So it's definitely way more challenging in the sense of the fundraising. By the way, not only dilutive, even in the sense of let's take Horizon 2020 grants. The number of submissions is like 3 or 4 times higher. So everything is much more intriguing in the sense of the funding. But I would dare to say that, and again, I'm saying it very, very cautiously because I can only speak from the perspective of our company, that in the sense of gaining initial traction, again, not commercial, but clinical trials, partnerships, basically speaking, design partners who can also assist in solidifying the product market fit. And basically, I'm talking about the large providers. Again, I'm saying it very, very cautiously, but actually, I think that the ecosystem is much more efficient now. So it's not like specific tools that we needed or mechanisms that we needed. It's basically a question of state of mind. Because if it was like mandatory for you to visit a provider before you start even discussing with them and to meet face to face, now the acceptance level is way different. Again, I don't know, maybe they also like what it is that we're doing technologically and taking into consideration the problem. But on the practical level, we started the clinical trial in the US without even visiting them. I don't think that would be a go pre-pandemic cases. Now we are doing a scale-up of this clinical trial, and again, we haven't even been there once. Same goes for the clinical trial in Italy that we started with the Modella Nostra. And by the end of the year, we're scheduled to start 2 additional clinical trials in Hungary and in the Netherlands. And we don't even know if they have a lower body part. I mean, we only made them through Zoom. So the ecosystem is way more efficient. I'm not saying that we can all live inside the metrics right now. I think it's mandatory that we will meet at some stage of the process and to do some sort of a physical handshake. I think it is mandatory. But together with that, again, pushing the fundraising aside, the ecosystem is much more acceptable. The acceptance level is much, much higher right now. And I don't think that there is a slight chance that we would have been able to gain clinical traction, formal clinical trials, healthcare approvals, IRBs, protocols prior to the pandemic in that rate, on that scale. And for us, it's crucial because in our company, the claim to fame is the data or the machine learning that analyzes the data. So again, I'm saying it very, very cautiously. Actually, the situation has improved because of the pandemic.
Right, interesting insights, and good to hear some positivity coming out of this whole pandemic in terms of, just as you mentioned, that change of mind and maybe acceptance to do things maybe a little bit differently and have that flexibility now. So Katarina, I know you're obviously coming from a little bit different perspective as a academic in the field, but based on some of your research or maybe just what you've been seeing and observing, are there any maybe interesting case studies or insights you have just into kind of how that pandemic has really forced companies in the sector to pivot or do things a little bit differently that might even be an improvement going forward over how things were done pre-pandemic?
There we are. Well, I think there are two things that I want to highlight, and they're coming just more from a general perspective and observation. I think if you look back again to the COVID-19 vaccines, and if we compare the traditional vaccine development pipelines with how it worked for the COVID-19 vaccines, we've seen what is possible in terms of parallelizing different steps, in terms of running clinical trials in parallel in different stages. And that is something that we could probably also use in other medical fields. Although beforehand, also the difference in regulatory approval times was actually not much if we compare across different countries. It was around 2 to 3 months between the European Medicines Agency and the FDA. But what the development of the COVID-19 vaccines has also shown us is the potential of public-private partnerships, right? Talking about Operation Warp Speed, but also the high volume advanced purchase agreements of the European Union. I think these are new devices by regulators that upfront tell you what the target is, what type of technology is to be developed, and then secures some kind of that secures basically revenues. And I think we could also use that in other areas. So Q is, for example, antibiotics and other critical areas where currently there may be not as much incentive for innovation. The second aspect, and I think this really relates also to Sebastian Körner and his company, is really that the COVID pandemic has laid bare the supply chain and the vulnerability of the supply chain. Beforehand, I think this was not as evident. From an own study where we looked at shortages reported in Switzerland before and after the pandemic, we actually don't see much changes in the first lockdown phase. But we also observe now that the issues in the supply chains are yet to become even larger now as we are going into second and third stages of the pandemic. And I think this is an issue that we will be dealing with much more, also in identifying how to maintain resilience in the supply chain.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for those comments. Just a little aside here, certainly the supply chain vulnerabilities are a huge topic, and actually one that we covered in an earlier webinar in the series. If anyone on the audience is interested, the recording of that webinar is on our YouTube channel. So little plug there, but certainly I think supply chain is affecting every industry in some way, shape, or form. Great, so let's move the discussion forward here and talk a little bit about some of the regulatory challenges involved in these cross-border collaborations from partners who are obviously operating in different regulatory frameworks. So starting with you and Katarina, from this big picture perspective, what obstacles does national or supranational regulation need to overcome to better foster these such collaboration and ensure timely access to medicines?
Well, I think some of that is already on the way in Europe, as we are thinking about a joint health technology assessment. So I believe a key obstacle is still to get products ready to market across different nationalities and constitutions. And I think it would be easier if some of that would be synthesized and brought together. So I think this is still like a larger obstacle that we have. What does joint health technology assessment mean? That means that basically the evidence that is generated now for the German value-based assessment is generated at a European level, so that it can be used in price negotiations and market access across different countries. And I think this is still the regulatory hurdle is still rather large here, that we can think more about to collaborate on.
Muted myself, my apologies. So Sebastian, how did maybe different regulatory issues affect Makotic when developing your new cryo chambers for vaccine storage and distribution? I know you had shown on your slide that they were being used in the Philippines. I don't know what other markets you've delivered into or intend to deliver into going forward, but maybe just talk as the regulatory affairs manager for the company, some of the challenges and what your approach was, keeping in mind that we had rapid timelines here to meet maybe these different regulatory frameworks.
Okay, so to speak, we are just adjusting two markets. So at first step, it's Germany and the Philippines, as you mentioned. Therefore, regulatory issues were not that big, which were addressed to our side. So we are a supplier for medical product, even if it's delivered to a vaccine producer and they use it for pharmaceutical products. The even higher requirements for that were covered by the producer and the storage facilities. They had a big impact on the registration of our product, so they were working together with us. Don't know if they were interested in this if we wouldn't have the pandemic. So if they would have supported us in that amount of time and energy, but it was great working together with them. And regarding the working together with the regulatory agencies in different markets, we see that it makes it much more easy with the MDSAP project. You see the medical device single audit program. So there are different markets covered with one audit program. So you're not just working over the year with 5-6 audits. So, but you're basically working for one single audit program, and there was covered the whole markets with Brazil, US, Canada, Australia, and Japan. Makes it much more easy to come up to this market. It would be a great opportunity to have more countries get into this single audit program. Would be much more easy to work in that field also for me. So I would be thankful for that. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Finally, turning the question over to you, Hage. I know that, Alluria's technology, you're not yet in the production phase, but per my understanding, you are in the pre-submission process with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So based on your experience to date, as far as you've gotten, maybe what could be done to make the process of launching new medical technologies or treatments easier in the markets that you're targeting?
Well, obviously the process is very slow, but I don't think you can do anything with that. As a young startup, we want to push everything very, very quickly, but obviously it's not doable. And to be honest, I don't think, again, looking at the process that we did started with the FDA, to be honest, it's pretty efficient. Again, obviously you have the safety and efficacy. The safety is mandatory, so I'm pushing it aside. But regarding the efficacy, again, echoing on our specific case, the overall goal is to try and identify whether we can be classified as a decision support solution, or basically to be exempt. And looking at the mechanisms that the FDA provides for, again, as you mentioned, pre-submission or even prior stages, looking at the mechanisms such as, the 513G possibility to examine the decision support likelihood. To be honest, it's pretty efficient. Obviously, again, it's slow. It's the bureaucracy is there, which is kind of obvious. But I was kind of surprised in the sense of our ability to actually validate, even prior to doing a full-scale submission, to validate what will be our likely positioning at the end of the day by using the mechanisms which are there. I cannot really reflect what is the situation with the C, because actually just last week we started the process with an advisor, so I'm not completely familiar with that. But regarding the FDA, surprisingly it was pretty efficient, slow, but pretty efficient. The mechanisms are there, and it's very well organized.
Okay, excellent. And then just final question to all of the panelists on this topic before we move on. In terms of these regulatory frameworks, do you think that there's something that the United States could learn from the EU or Germany specifically, or vice versa?
Now, as I've mentioned, the CE mark in the Europe combines different markets. So MD-Sub program is also started for US. So they seem to have learned about some issues. It's just about the way to get to registration. In the US, there would be more like a progressive approach, like they get to the point that they think it's safe, so we get to it. In Europe, it's more about security, thinking about more security in the first step. So maybe something in the middle would be a good approach to get products faster onto the market. So not just thinking about security, as Hage said, this would be basic. Yeah, everyone wants to have secure products, but to mix up the approaches, maybe this might be effect. Yeah.
Great. All right, well, moving on, let's now change over and discuss some best practices for companies to actually identify, engage, and secure these collaboration partners. Starting with you, Hage, as an Israeli-based startup, I know that your plans are to operate and sell your products and technologies into multiple markets across the world, including the EU and the US. What was your experience? We already talked about kind of doing this in the digital framework, but beyond that, what was your experience finding these potential funding partners or clinical trial partners in both markets? Are there lessons that you learned, best practices for how to identify, attract, engage, and even collaborate and work with these partners in both markets that you could share with our audience?
So obviously, again, I would separate the funding issue from the traction, or in our case, clinical trials element. So regarding the funding, again, it was a lot of footwork. At the end of the day, the step that we made that actually streamlined everything for us, and from that actually we were able to raise funds, is actually a US-based acceleration program called the Health Wildcatters. You can look them up. They were super efficient in not only solidifying, better understanding the product market fit, and understanding the ecosystem, coverage mechanisms and everything, but they also provided like the preliminary funding, again with the super evaluation, which is obvious, but again, it was like the initial investment is always the hardest. So, but again, it was a lot of footwork. And regarding the clinical traction, so I actually regret to say that I don't think that we would have been able to get real traction without the preliminary clinical trial that we done on the bootstrap mode in Israel. Again, the concept is interesting, the problem is interesting, the fact that everyone are guessing and everything is trial and error, everyone knows that. But together with that, and again, I'm saying it's maybe it's not optimistic what I'm saying, but I don't think there is a chance we would have been able to scale up, to do scale up clinical trials without showing some real clinical evidence from Israel, both in the sense of the actual outcomes that we came with, and moreover in the sense that it was like formal measurement with the largest HMO that are kind of well known with a very high reputation. So Obviously, it was a long and winding road with a lot of bootstrap elements. It took us over a year because of the COVID. But I regret to say that I don't think we would have been able to do any scale-ups or gain not only interest, but actual traction without that preliminary clinical trial. So again, it was a long and winding road, but and currently it's okay because we are actually beyond that. But it was a huge constraint on the entire process, sadly. So.
Understood. Well, you had just mentioned, and this is a question I was going to ask you later, but I'll just go ahead and ask it now since you brought up, working with the accelerator in the U.S. Health Wildcatters. Glad to hear that they gave you some guidance as well as some funding. If I'm not mistaken, I had also read that Illuria is partnering with a German-based accelerator as well, the Life Science Accelerator Baden-Württemberg. So maybe just tell us what's different from your perspective in working with a US-based accelerator, a German-based accelerator. Where do you see the commonalities, the differences, and maybe what advice would you have for other startups in how to best partner with such accelerators in both countries?
So it's very similar and completely different from the same sentence. Obviously, the guidelines are similar, the business model canvas and all the theory behind it and everything. Obviously, this is pretty much generic. Together with that, I'm a big fan of acceleration programs. Again, I'm not saying that I would start an acceleration program in the Philippines tomorrow morning, but taking into consideration that the market that we are targeting, Germany and the US, I think, again, echoing on the two specific problems that you mentioned and some others that we are in discussions with, that they were super instrumental in better explaining how does the ecosystem looks like, what are the constraints we're facing, not only the regulatory or reimbursement constraints, getting the relationship, they're getting some personal mentoring from local people that can actually assist you. Some of them actually invested in us afterwards. So these two acceleration programs, again, we are kind of in the middle of the acceleration program in Germany. So we don't have a full review on it yet, but the acceleration program in the US was super instrumental, not only in the sense of the funding, but in the sense I would call it the mentoring, but the practical mentoring. I mean, getting the connections, getting to speak with a lot of payers, a lot of providers. We have very close relationship because of this program with actually 6 providers in the States. I'm talking about large ones. Not only Cincinnati Children's, Sinai, Children's Health. I mean, so it was super helpful running, going through an acceleration program.
Excellent. So over to you, Sebastian. I'm not sure to what extent Makotic has partnered with different sorts of collaboration partners in either country, but do you have anything to add to this broad topic in terms of best practices for finding, engaging, and working with these sorts of collaboration partners?
Keep it short. No, nothing to add from my side.
Okay, understood. Appreciate the honesty. We'll move over. I have one last question on this topic for you, Katarina, and you had in some of your earlier remarks talked about one thing from COVID is kind of public-private partnerships in terms of funding for new drug technologies that came out of the COVID vaccine, and hopefully is a model that we'll see more of going forward. Not so much a question as just an invitation for you to share a few more general comments on that topic. How do you see these public-private partnerships developing forward, maybe when there isn't such a urgent need in terms of at least the public's perception? How do you get this public buy-in? And also, to what extent maybe do you see non-industry funding sources playing a role for driving innovation going forward?
Well, yeah, thank you. I think we shouldn't forget that also, public funding is substantially contributing to innovation. And we've looked at that more deeply from the perspective of a regional innovation system in Europe for cardiovascular devices. So we basically took all the cardiovascular devices that have been licensed by the FDA, looked at where do people sit that innovate on these devices in Europe. And we see that there is a strong link also with receiving funding by the EU FP7 framework program, but also by Horizon 2020. So much of the collaboration only becomes possible because the innovators on the device side, but also the users and those that develop the applications, so the physicians, right? So the people that really bring the technology to patients get the opportunity to work together and evaluate those products in clinical trials. So I think this is, we should also look at the stage beyond invention and see that this is also substantially driven by public investments.
Great, thanks for that. Great, so to wrap up today's discussion, I'd just like to look forward maybe a little bit in terms of, you know, what the companies represented on the panel see in their immediate future as organizations, and of course, what you, Dr. Blanco, see as, you know, bigger trends going forward here. But let's start with you, Sebastian. Reading up on your company a little bit, I see, of course, that you have a subsidiary office in the United States. I believe it was in the state of South Carolina. Looks like it's a relatively new office, and at least in the current state, primarily focused on, you know, sales. So what's maybe your strategy, if you're able to share this company information? What's your strategy for further developing this U.S. subsidiary? Do you plan to potentially localize additional functions, maybe have some R&D product development locally in the US, or even manufacturing assembly operations? And kind of how do you see the ideal interplay going forward in terms of internal collaboration between team members at a US subsidiary and a German headquarter?
Yeah, so to say, you've said relatively young. Yes, that's right. It's just 15 months in advance that we've opened it again. So we had one before, which was closed, but we are back again. The starting point might be that we have to start with the cryo chamber as a medical product on the American and North American market itself. And from regulatory side, there are now more requirements starting from the MDR. The MDR is active without any chances to go around from May 2021. So if you want to get on the market, there are restrictions, there are requirements. We were starting to get into the MDSAP program right now. So there are also additional requirements for the office in the US. You have to have persons which are able in the vigilance system, in the post-market surveillance. You need people who have knowledge in that. So we want to build this up for sure. And in the second step, for sure, we want to have also some parts built in the US, which makes it more easy to access the American market, where we also have a regulatory office part in the US office. So to see the wishes from the American users, from the FDA, from the MDSAP program, also to cover all those facts. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that. Hage, what are the next planned steps for Illuria going forward, and how will you continue to leverage the existing partners you have in both the US and Germany, or maybe bring new partners on board to help drive your product launch and success in the market forward?
So it's production, and again, production. I mean, the most important element is to gain real traction, to get real feedback from users, which will be initially it will be the parents, basically, as a gatekeeper to the physician, so to speak. So technically, we have started the actual development. We should be in the market by mid-2022, worst case scenario. And not only in the sense of getting some preliminary traction and to actually sense the end users, but actually to gain initial commercial traction. Again, not B2B, obviously we will not be regulated by then, and the coverage mechanisms are there, but again, I don't think we can onboard them. But through some partnerships, we are leveraging that actually works currently with parents. So this is like the basic goal. The basic goal is to gain initial traction. Together with that, and in parallel with that, at the end of the day, the claim to fame is the interface between the data that we're getting and our ability to train algorithms to analyze markers and deliver some sort of a clinical validated analysis. So in parallel to the production, I mentioned the clinical trials that we starting in Europe. So actually, it's very likely that we'll start additional clinical trials, and again in Europe. And I can say that the acceptance levels of I would say all of the 15 providers that we're currently in touch with is very, very high. I mean, actually, our ability to basically piggyback on existing processes and existing clinical trials is surprisingly high. In most of them, we don't even have to pay for the clinical trial. So obviously, another goal, which will be in parallel to gaining initial commercial traction, is to get some more data from maybe, hopefully, Germany as well, with the Central Institute of Mental Health, but definitely from Italy, Hungary, Netherlands, and maybe even France.
Understood. And if I may ask, your production activities, are those going to be planned for Israel, or do you potentially plan to also, or instead of Israel, produce in another country? And are you going to internalize this, or maybe look for a contract manufacturing partner to help you maybe speed up the production launch time?
So I'm a proud Israeli, but it's very hard to do business in Israel. You know, working with basically in Israel, it's only HMOs. It's very difficult commercially to start business with them. They don't like you to earn money, so it's very intriguing. So I would assume that the initial production will be again. I'm talking about the B2B2C. I mean, approaching the parents initially will be in Western Europe through a partnership that we're having. Technically, I think it will be in the Nordics and in Germany, maybe also the Netherlands. And together with that, again, depending on the partnership that we're having in the States, also in the States as a global market, as a single market. Again, I know it's very fragmented, but so it will be both in Western Europe and in the States, and unfortunately not in Israel, because it's kind of difficult to operate here.
Understood, but I think that's still an interesting case study in how these innovative startups, even coming from third countries, can really leverage these partnerships and really get their businesses off the ground in foreign markets, maybe even before their domestic market. So final question then to you, Katarina, you know, given what we've seen as a global community, or experienced, I guess, as a global community during the pandemic, where do you see cross-border collaboration in the field headed next? Is it going to accelerate, decelerate, stay rather the same? And what are the specific topics maybe that you're planning on focusing next in your academic research?
Well, first of all, I think that the regulatory processes overall, although we see that the COVID-19 vaccines are outstanding, have not changed too much due to the COVID-19 pandemic, if you look at the broad set of technologies. But what we see is that we see increasingly connected technologies that combine pharmaceuticals and apps. And I think this will be a challenge to evaluate these products. And I think this is where I will be also heading towards looking at, you know, what is the value of these products, how different policies to evaluate these products work out and play out for the different countries, and what is the effect on patient health and use.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much once again to all of our panelists. I thought that was a very interesting conversation. I'm sure everyone is tired of hearing me talk and asking all the questions. So at this point, I would love to open up the floor to our audience for an interactive Q&A with our three panelists here. If you prefer, of course, you could type your question into the chat function, or please just raise your virtual hand and go ahead and turn your video on and ask directly. So yeah, audience, the floor is yours now. Okay, I see one that just came in here on the chat. I'll just go ahead and read this out loud. Many experiments or clinical trials were paused or canceled due to a lack of access to doctors and patients and the focus on COVID. Do you see the way clinical trials are being run changing going forward? Building on that, the COVID vaccine production was accelerated. Will this type of swift vaccine production continue? lot to unpack in that question. So please, any of our panelists who'd like to add some insight there.
Again, echoing on what I said before, I can only resonate on the specific case of what it is that we're doing. And actually, in our case, it was the other way around completely. It was much easier for us to initiate formal clinical processes, again, with LCT approvals and protocols and everything. The acceptance level was very, very high. And moreover, as I said before, we actually were able to piggyback on existing clinical trials, at least in Italy and potentially also in Hungary. So actually, from our experience, that wasn't the case. Again, I'm talking from a very, very narrow point of view, so I'm saying it very, very consciously, but this is not what we experienced.
Interesting perspective. Anyone else would like to add anything to the question that we received here? Okay, well, moving on then, other questions from the audience, please don't be shy. We've got some great speakers here. Use the opportunity. No? Shy group today. Okay, well, if we don't have, questions from the audience, I guess we can move more quickly into the virtual networking rounds, but of course don't want to cancel this if there's still some questions from the audience for our speakers here. Okay, well then I guess we can move on to virtual networking. If people would like to stay, please do continue the conversation in maybe smaller groups. We'll go into breakout groups. And if not, thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your evening or workday, depending on where you joined us from. So I'd now like to ask my colleague to please go ahead and break the remaining participants into these breakout rooms for the virtual networking. Needed to get back to their days. I just pulled the remaining people back together here. If anyone would like to continue to ask a few questions, maybe in a smaller setting, you'll be more comfortable to engage our speakers. If not, of course, we can wrap this up a little bit early and let everyone get back to their either Feierabend in Germany or checking those emails if you're here in the US. Okay, well, from that perspective, I guess then maybe we do just wrap this up here a little bit earlier than scheduled. But once again, thank you to everyone for attending today. Thank you so much, Hage, Sebastian, and Katerina, for your insights. We will be, as we discussed, we will be posting the recording of today's conversation on our YouTube channel and doing another round of promotion. So hopefully people who weren't able to join us today for whatever reason will still be able to go and watch the recording and hear your insights. I thought it was a exceptionally interesting conversation. So thanks again for your time, for your insights, and hopefully we can stay connected with you from the German American Chamber of Commerce for other programming or industry relevant events that we have going forward. So just one final thanks to everybody from my side. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
So much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.